one of our early theses for BPI was that most people actually don't have that strong of opinion about Bitcoin yet. You can't have an opinion on something you don't really know much about, or you can, but it's not going to be the most informed opinion. So most people don't know what they don't know. So they don't know enough to love or hate Bitcoin. What that means is the battle lines are still being drawn. The narratives are actively changing, and we have the opportunity to shape those narratives. For the United States, is Bitcoin good? Is Bitcoin bad? Is it somewhere in the middle, right? Right now, there are a large number of people who are teetering on Bitcoin bad. That doesn't mean everybody's on that side. That just means that some of the more vocal people in our government are on that side. Now, ultimately, the reason I bring that up is because you don't get sound policy. You don't get people to come to Bitcoin is good if you don't engage with them, if you don't talk to them, if you don't meet them where they're at.
Welcome to the Builders in Bitcoin podcast, a podcast about the people who bring Bitcoin to life. I'm your host, Rod, and I go by the handle BitKite on Twitter. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Grant McCarty, co-founder and co-executive director of the Bitcoin Policy Institute, to discuss political engagement and advocacy around Bitcoin. In this episode, we dig into why BPI is an important part of outreach and how it helps shape politicians' understanding of Bitcoin, some of the biggest risks to Bitcoin from government regulation, the differences in approach to state versus federal policy when it comes to Bitcoin, and a lot more, including the announcement of a new podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation with Grant, and I hope you will too. So let's just jump right in. My man, Grant, how the heck are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Of course, man. You've been a mainstay at Bitcoin Park. Love seeing you here. You have a great energy and just a great disposition about yourself. And you inspire me, man, just on a number of fronts.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if you ever said anything like that to me, off the pod. So this is pretty special. Also, you telling me that I have a lot of energy or good energy, that means a lot coming from you.
Thanks, man. You see, other people listen to this, so this is where I compliment people. But, off the record, that's when I'm like, giving you direct.
Like Grant, not actually a big fan.
Yeah, not a big fan. If you don't mind staying in this one little cubby area of the park, don't come, out and see other people. It would be great. But no, man, I will say the younger generation, especially in Bitcoin, truly does inspire me. Like you, Dave Zell, Nick Campmine, a number of these folks. I can't be around you guys enough because I'm being serious. It's like a different way of think, that different way you guys think, the different way you guys carry yourself, the different way you guys work. And which is probably a good segue into my first question, which I will say I'm a bit skeptical. And I said this, I think, to Zell on the pod as well, especially young, really smart folks like yourself, getting into politics and advocacy and trying to work with the government at such an early age. So I'm curious, explaining how you got into Bitcoin and how you got to Bitcoin Policy Institute and why you feel like this is the best use of your time.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd like to start, I guess, with the idea that, I'm skeptical too. Skeptical of politics, broadly, skeptical of young people. I think, as a fellow young person, right, it's very easy to be a revolutionary, right? It's very easy to be someone who brings energy every day when you're young and is excited to kind of, overthrow the current regime and make change. Young people have been about that, for all of history. And I think really societies are built strongly when you have the push-pull dynamic between young people and seasoned veterans, right? One without the other pulls too strongly in one direction. And so I think young people essentially are balancing the scale. They recognize, what has not worked with past generations. They recognize what hasn't worked in their lives, growing up. They've seen it in real time, and then they have the energy, the passion to, go out, work those 50, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. I don't have a wife. I don't have kids. This is the time of my life when I can expend, a bunch of my energy, a bunch of my time into something that I'm passionate about. which really quick is why I'm continually impressed with what you're able to do, having those things that I just mentioned. So maybe I won't have an excuse
That's
later
right.
on. But yeah, how did I get into Bitcoin? I think like most people, I got into Bitcoin by doing something illegal. I was in high school.
Tom, we may need to cut this out now.
Yeah, no, I was in high school, and I'm not I don't stand by every one of my actions in high school. In fact, I probably stand by very few of my actions in high school. But
That's a good thing.
trying to, we didn't have HBO, $15 a month, in my family. So, found out about this Bitcoin thing, found out, oh my gosh, I can buy an HBO account off the dark web for like $10. So, go online, buy Bitcoin, buy my HBO login, get scammed,
Yeah.
and I'm hooked, right?
Yeah.
I go, all right, I don't know where my money went. I can't call the police. I just tried to commit a crime. What is this magic internet money? This was a revelation, right? Because at first it started as a novelty, and then being on the dark web, being kind of excited by the Tor and realizing, okay, people can't track me. I have privacy. This money that I just sent, I could send it to anybody in the world, almost instantly. And as a teenager, that's exciting for the sake of being exciting. But what it did is it led me to the anonymous message boards where journalists and dissidents are discussing online, where they're talking about how Bitcoin is actually being used in their day-to-day lives to fight for freedom, right? And so this was something I was exposed to in high school simply because I was a little idiot high schooler. But those ideas and those principles, stayed with me, and those stories of real people online using, tools and speech to fight back, that was exciting. And ultimately, it led me to worked in a lot of different industries, worked on some startups, worked in education, started an education company, really passionate about education. But ultimately, I think what I'm really passionate about are what I call like autonomy multipliers, right?
Yeah, explain that.
So one of the reasons I'm drawn to education is because if you have a good education, so many other good things follow, right? If you have a good education, you have access to uh, an extreme number of jobs as opposed to somebody who doesn't have access to education. You're going to be able to take care of yourself more effectively, better nutrition. You're going to be able to have more effective relationships, right? Kind of go down the line. Education can be this foundation for a more meaningful, autonomous life, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that having an education is going to, make you a better person or make your life guaranteed to be better, but it gives you the opportunity and the tools to make a better life for yourself. And so I look at Bitcoin as the same way, where if you give someone control over their money and you give someone access to free and open information, free and open money, what that does is it allows not me or you to decide what's best for someone. It allows them to decide what's best for their own life. And so when someone has control over their money, when they have an adequate amount of money, they get to decide what is a meaningful life. And right now there are billions of people in the world who don't even have the foundational, if you think of like a hierarchy of needs kind of pyramid, they don't even have the bottom of that pyramid to be able to reach self-actualization or quote unquote meaningful life.
Totally.
I think money is one of those foundational needs.
Yeah. So I love that, by the way. I'm very interested in the background now, as this teenager that's like super based and then growing like into the person that you are. And then, so I guess why did you decide that BPI specific or the Bitcoin Policy Institute specifically was the best use of your entrepreneurial talent and to start this with Dave?
Another good question. I knew I was interested in Bitcoin. I was passionate about Bitcoin. David and I sat down and asked ourselves, where is our unique value, right? This is something that I'm constantly interested in as someone who has been lucky enough to receive an education, as someone who has been, privileged in many aspects of my life. Good family, was able to go to college, was able to get an MBA. I had options for what I wanted to do. And I could have gone a lot of different directions. That's at once exciting. It is also, I think it creates a little bit of pressure to make sure that what you're doing is maximizing the privilege that you've been given, right?
Yep.
And so what David and I did is we sat down for hours and hours and hours, and we were good friends before we started this as well. So, having some deep conversations and figuring out like, all right, what are we trying to do here? Both in Bitcoin, but also with our lives, right? What is something that is going to be genuinely meaningful? Something where the energy that I'm expending and putting in is exponentially multiplied on the way out, right? So ultimately, David and I were working at Bitcoin Magazine. We were the co-directors of policy and public affairs because we're just policy wonks and because, politics was kind of gaining steam in Bitcoin about a year and a half ago. But we realized, hey, there's more that we can do here. And there's a lot of white space in this industry. Bitcoiners weren't a huge fan of politics, but David and I, we were. And we're also Bitcoiners first. So we looked around, we saw some white space, we saw a lot of work that we thought the users in the United States would benefit from, and we just went to work. And so long story short, over the past year, we've been working on multiple different political initiatives and have really honed in on the Bitcoin Policy Institute as something that is wholly unique in the space, providing academic research, talking to lawmakers from a purely Bitcoin perspective is something that didn't exist before we were around. And frankly, I'm incredibly biased here, but I think we have stayed true to the Bitcoin ethos through our work and made sure to kind of stay true to the community that we started with.
Yeah. And in our interactions and what I've seen you guys do, I believe it and I see it. And so there's proof of work there, that's for sure. And you're right, like politics in general, super skeptical. Still am skeptical. With that said, I think with you and David, and now the number of conversations, that I've been privy to have with folks at the local, state, and federal level, people do care. And I'll mention a couple points, and then I'll get to my next question, which is you mentioned relationships. Relationships do matter. And having these conversations, there may not be a direct or a transactional benefit of a conversation, but with the folks that are in, forget the politicians aside, there's teams behind these politicians that do want to learn more about Bitcoin, the capital B, the monetary network, and Bitcoin, the lowercase b, the reserve asset. They just don't have the time, capital, or incentive to really dig in to listening to podcasts, articles, going to conferences, and so on, like we do, and go down that rabbit hole. They need more trusted resources to be able to ping with questions around mining, around Lightning, around XYZ about Bitcoin. And we've been very fortunate here at the park. A number of folks have reached out to us in the political realm, and I just don't know how to talk their language or why they would want to talk to a joker like me. So I always bring you along, and we've had probably now 10 meetings or so, give or take, and then you guys take the lead and go from there, which is really cool to see. And so I say that because there's so much noise. And there's so many misaligned incentives at the lobbying or advocacy level with these policymakers, and they're hearing a story, and it's refreshing to hear the Bitcoin story, even though Bitcoin, the monetary network, will not need it. But for us as individuals, it's more helpful, living our day-to-day lives when we have policymakers that are understanding and using Bitcoin. So I say all that is because the BPI Fellows is really interesting to me. So if you could maybe explain the Fellows program and why you've selected the folks that you have, and kind of dig into that, would be helpful.
Yeah. So at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, we have over a dozen, expert academic fellows with PhDs ranging from economics to environmental science. Some folks have JDs, they're lawyers. Really what we're trying to do at BPI is we're studying the future of money. And we're a think tank research center that is exploring Bitcoin and other open monetary networks from a policy perspective, when you do that, you need foundational research, you need data, you need the things that people in Washington, D.C. respond to. If you, for example, if you were following the Biden executive order trying to create a comprehensive framework for digital assets, just at a high level, what that did was essentially Joe Biden and his administration called to all of these other departments in the White House and said, hey, you have 90 days, you have 180 days to produce a report that answers these questions about digital assets. So, Department of Treasury, tell me about how digital assets impacts the most vulnerable populations in our country. Department of Commerce, how does digital assets make America more competitive on an economic level, right? Things like that. And what happens is these departments, when they produce their reports, they're looking for trusted sources. How do these people do research? Well, they do research just like anybody else. They go on Google and Google Scholar or JSTOR or any of these things, and they're finding academic journals. They're finding trusted resources.org websites.
That makes a lot of sense now to me, because I was always wondering why regulatory affairs, head of regulatory affairs or head of policy or whatever at these companies. I was like, why does that role even exist?
Yeah.
Well, when you search probably on Google, or when they need to call somebody up and what's our position.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So look, I think a lot of people either give our government too little credit or too much credit. At the end of the day, our government is made up of people, everyday people, just like you and me, trying to do their jobs and trying to do their jobs well. When they're writing these reports, they're looking to their version of experts, right? And in the quote unquote fiat world, or just the everyday world, there are kind of agreed upon versions of or heuristics of what an expert looks like. For many people, it's, do you have a master's? Do you have a PhD?
Yep.
Have you written and published something, that's in a respected publication on this issue? And so ultimately what BPI is doing is we realized, look, there are a number of brilliant people in Bitcoin, like too many to count. It is
Totally.
unbelievable. That's something that drew me to this industry in the first place. The kind of intellectual brain power in Bitcoin is astounding. That said, the intellectual brain power in Bitcoin, this is one of the beautiful things about it, but it's also a thing that has negatively impacted in Washington, is that a lot of that intellectual brain power ends up on online chat forums. It ends up in Medium blog posts. The reality is, the person, helping write the report at the Department of Treasury isn't reading a Medium blog post. And if they do, they're sure as heck not citing it in their report. And so a great example of that is if you look at the report that was released by the Office of Science and Technology Policy on Bitcoin and Bitcoin, or on, they call it crypto mining, but we know what that means, right? On Bitcoin mining, every single source that they link into there is an academic source. It is an academic journal. It is a trusted publication that these people respond to. These people are academics working in the OSTP, and they go where academics go.
Now, you're uncovering something, because it seems like now academia tied to these research centers that are building out these blockchain protocol, quote unquote blockchain protocols. It's like this vicious circle, if you will, of development and advocacy in that space. And this is why it's gotten so much, one of the reasons why potentially it's gotten so much steam potentially in Washington.
For sure. A lot of these other crypto projects out there have a PhD on their founding team. They have someone who, is a PhD in any number of things, right? But again, a quote unquote kind of like fiat expert. And so what happens is, and if they don't have that, to your point, they're hiring, lobbying firms, they're creating educational materials, they're connected with a network of academics who are able to write research on their specific crypto project. And so it legitimizes their project, because now all of a sudden, this coin is mentioned in an academic journal, or the concept of this coin is published in an academic journal. There are being simulations run on these various projects. And so, Bitcoin has not had that. Bitcoin doesn't have a marketing department. Bitcoin doesn't have a centralized, thankfully, exactly. Bitcoin doesn't have a centralized, governance or a centralized institution that is able to say, hey, we're going to put together, we're going to endow a $10 million research center full of academics to produce this research and legitimize Bitcoin from a policy perspective. To your point, look, Bitcoin doesn't need us. Bitcoin doesn't need any of us. The network will be just fine. But the reality is users, especially in the United States, are not 100% going to be fine. There are many realities, many worlds where Bitcoin users in the United States are stifled, or we can get into those risks a little bit more. But ultimately, to kind of summarize the point here, why BPI, why fellows, we are trying to speak the language of DC. We're trying to bring fiat credentials and bring traditional expertise from the world of Bitcoin into Washington. And ultimately, if throwing up the Bitcoin Policy Institute banner and being a buttoned-up organization is what makes people in Washington finally listen to the brilliant people in Bitcoin, then to me, that's something I'm going to do 10 times out of 10.
Totally. You mentioned some of the risks. I'm just curious. What would you say is like, especially in what's happening in Washington, what's like top of mind right now to you?
This isn't going to surprise you, and I can spare you, going down the 10 different risks. But the proof of work ban is not a pipe dream anymore. I think a lot of people have talked about this as, they recognize that it's a possibility, but maybe haven't taken it as seriously as the threat really is. One way I like to think about this is through just a basic expected value calculation, right? Which is essentially if there is a percentage chance and a significant percentage chance, that mining is banned in the United States, that is an existential risk to Bitcoin users in the United States, right? So we just put that number as 0.
Why is that a risk to Bitcoin users in the United States?
Banning proof of work mining?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, all of the Bitcoin firepower, the Bitcoin brain power, it's not going to be in a country that bans proof of work mining.
Yeah.
What we're seeing, and I'm sure you can talk about this a little bit, right, is, in Nashville, for example, or some of these other cities in the United States are rapidly kind of becoming Bitcoin hubs, right? People are inspired by this intellectual, firepower that we're talking about. They want to go where other innovators are going. If the United States decides that we're not going to be an innovator in Bitcoin because we don't want to deal with the emissions of Bitcoin mining, Bitcoiners are not going to stay here. Bitcoiners are some of the most, globalized people that we've had in history. Bitcoiners will go where the energy is cheapest. They'll go where the policy is best for them. And they're going to go where other Bitcoiners are going because that's what's exciting, and that's where the real incredible innovation is going to happen.
So 2 things. One, Nashville's under the radar, so we'll just keep it at that. All these other places are great. Go there for Bitcoin and other things. Come visit us, and if you decide to stay, right, Tom, we'll just stay here, and
We won't kick you out.
we will not kick you out. The second thing, I agree. I think like 99 out of 100 would be like Bitcoin nomads and find the jurisdiction that is most favorable to them. I'm probably in that one group where, especially family here being raised, wife's family from here, grandparents from here, and the list goes on. And the state of Tennessee is just, and specifically talking my own book about the state and then the city. I think it's so fascinating, especially on the empowering the states to make their own decisions, and then the conversations we've had with state policymakers versus the federal policymakers and such. I think, again, we'll see what happens. Cautiously optimistic about the future, and I'm very bullish on Tennessee. Don't get me wrong, but cautiously optimistic about where this can go at the state level. Why? Because you just nailed it. Like the type of people that are coming here with the money and the capital investments across the state is just absolutely mind-boggling.
It's incredible.
And so one clarification that was helpful for me, and I'm curious to know or have you expand on it, which is what's the difference between the state policy side and the federal side as it relates to Bitcoin? And for folks that are listening to this, where could they be helpful with state policymakers
Mm,
or even like on the federal side?
sure. So one of the best ways that it was described to me, and I think this is a very succinct kind of heuristic for understanding state versus federal, is at the federal level, there are many threats to Bitcoin, and at the state level, there are many opportunities. So ultimately, our federal government moves very slow, very, very slow. And that means when action is finally taken, a lot of times it can be pretty drastic action, right? If it takes a couple years to pass a policy, if something is in committee for months and months and months, a lot of times politicians don't want to waste that on something, that they don't view as kind of worth their time or super meaningful. So what happens is you get these big swings, but these big swings happen, you know, basically like once a year. And so uh, on the federal level, right now, one of the biggest attacks that we're seeing again is on proof of work. You're seeing a contingent of people in Washington really attack Bitcoin for its energy emissions, carbon emissions. And as a result, we're seeing language from the current administration that suggests that a proof of work ban or moratorium could be on the horizon. That is a massive, massive swing. On a state level, what we're seeing is things can move a lot faster
For good or bad,
for
right?
good.
Like New York versus, let's say, a Texas, which is just a great example, in my opinion.
Definitely. In states also, more and more we're seeing people, to your point of people, moving to Nashville, moving to Tennessee, we're seeing people move to places that align with their values.
Yes.
And what that allows you to do is, move to a city, move to a state that ultimately is passing legislation that has lawmakers who are supporting innovation and not trying to stifle it. So what we see on a state level is there are opportunities for, local municipalities to provide incentives for Bitcoin companies to move there, or state and local governments to amend certain laws, jurisdictional laws, licensing laws that ultimately make it much easier for a Bitcoin company to operate in that state than another one. And so that is where the opportunity lies, is federal. It's going to be pretty slow. There could be some really bad things that happen, but states have the opportunity to hunker down to protect rights for their citizens and ultimately inject innovation into their municipalities.
So I don't know what the thing is on Twitter. I think it's called a tweet stamp or a Twitter stamp or something like that. Tom, we need to timestamp that, and we're going to come back to that because you've alluded to a number of things, especially at the state level. And there was one conversation you and I had, and I'm pretty sure I called the guys both spooks in the meeting because just at a high level, we were talking about like, what they want to accomplish, and they're like, we want to accomplish three things for our constituents, as well as what the us in the policy world or policymakers care about, which is liberty, sovereignty, and freedom. I'm like, that just aligns to what why or one of the reasons why Bitcoiners use Bitcoin as a tool. And I do think, and we joke, not joke, but I think this will be serious about making, Nashville and Tennessee sovereign valley. And I think that could happen with the type of folks that are coming here and the type of incentives that we could provide for these folks.
100%, right? Palo Alto and California has Silicon Valley. Nashville and Tennessee, we've got Sovereign Valley.
I love it, man. Dude, now I'm just thinking out loud. These folks, the teams behind these policymakers, right? They need more resources, like you just said. As an aside, I'm going to follow up with you on this post this pod, but we need to do a podcast, like a weekly. This week in Bitcoin and public policy, we go through the 1 to 2 to 3 articles you need to read. You provide the commentary. We will produce the pod and get it out there so that it's like very digestible for folks to quickly, because there's 30-page to 100-page reports. It's like I'm pretty sure they just read like the 1-page summary on the fact sheet or send that around.
100%.
Is it? Yeah.
100%. Real quick, would people listen? You're someone who has been, and I think you said it earlier, you've been highly skeptical of politics. Why are you sitting here talking to me about politics right now? What swayed you? And
because I like hanging out with you. I will say, okay, so I will answer that, but this is my podcast. I get to ask the question. I'm just joking. I actually think that's a fair question because, like, why the heck am I in now advocacy? And, even with the park, Matt and I care deeply about helping drive local community adoption with Bitcoin. We care deeply about fostering Bitcoin and free and open source development. And then there's now this another like sliver, which is around the advocacy side. We've been fortunate to speak with folks from like the Beacon Center to other policymakers and
Yep.
so on. And, the regulatory beast could continue to get larger. And it's not like you're going to just shoot it with one shot and it just goes down, and again, this is where people call me a Bitcoin minimalist. It's like, nor should that maybe be the answer.
Mm.
But it should be carefully, no, not even carefully. It should be consistently questioned. Why do we have these licenses? Why are these policies in place from 1939 and so on? Is this helpful for our local constituencies? Let's revisit this and remove policies such that we can, foster local community development and more. Just like be like. What was that braid example that our friend provided last night? The women's braiding. There was like a license where like someone had like, coming into the state of Tennessee specifically and wanted to open up a hair salon, and she couldn't because she didn't have the specific number of hours.
You need 1,500 hours of training, and you need to apply and pay for the license.
And then every year you got to pay for that license again and again and again. And the lady was like, I've been braiding hair since I was like 10 years old.
Yep.
I had my own, shop in whatever state she was, and I want to set up here and be a productive member of my community and provide value. So all of these hurdles. And so going all the way back to why I'm now somewhat interested, still skeptical, but I'm now more open to having the conversation only if you and Dave and others are with me having the conversation, because I do believe there's a specific language, how you guys talk to each other, how you guys can provide value. And for me, I have no dog in the hunt. I just want, Bitcoin to succeed, and I want there to be more knowledgeable and understanding policymakers.
Well, I guess that is your dog in the hunt, right? You said you're the 1 out of 100 Bitcoiners who aren't going to move if things go really poorly here in this country or in this state.
The country is a different story.
Sure. So in this state, right? And thinking about that, thinking about all the Bitcoiners who have families who are going to be here or wherever they are for generations, we want to be able to protect Bitcoin for their kids and their kids' kids and their kids.
Totally.
You kind of go down the line. So yeah, the network will be fine. Do you want to go use the network in Bangkok and, uproot your entire life and your family and your lineage just to, go use the Bitcoin network? Or would you rather, stay in a nation that for the past couple hundred years has, stood for freedom, stood for liberty, and has the opportunity to do that with Bitcoin? But frankly, it is not a guarantee.
My family did that once in their lifetime. I'm done with that. Getting up and
one and done.
Yeah, one and done in that regard. Not one and done with kids, that's for sure. I said on Marty's pod, I have more kids than Bitcoin, as Tom chuckles at me. But so we're going to do this pod, by the way, and I'm going to put it in. We're like literally, Tom, we're going to create this pod. We're going to create the dedicated podcast feed, and we're actually going to put it in the show notes.
This is like proposing to someone at a baseball game, in public. It's like they can't say no.
That's right.
You put me on the spot here. Yeah. All right, we're doing a podcast.
Let's do it.
It's on record.
We're doing it in the studio here. You're here already in Nashville, so it'll be a banger. And I will say, like, the fact that these folks send just articles and like tidbits around to each other, I think if we get quality, digestible pieces of audio content for these folks, it could help move the needle, in our own way.
Yeah, you're talking about like staffers and politicians.
Totally.
Yeah, I guess to add a little color to that, right? One of the most insightful comments that I ever received about Washington is somebody told me our country is run by a bunch of 20-year-olds surviving off of happy hours and free Chick-fil-A at events that they go to in D.C.
Oh my God.
And that's the reality, right? Is Washington, when you have a politician who's speaking out on an issue, it's not like they did the 100 hours of research, to fully understand that issue. What they had is a legislative director or a staffer, on their team who was assigned a bucket of issues, and they did the research, and they went to the events, and they talked to people, and they read the articles, they read the headlines, they listened to the podcast, they watched the videos. Now, a lot of people think, it's all about getting the politicians, or that politicians are spineless, or whatever people think about politicians. You can think that, but the reality is Washington, the gears are turning by the people behind the people really speaking out in public.
You nailed it, and this is probably a good segue into. So we'll drop this pod on Monday, and so 2 or 3 days later, and 3 days later, Thursday, November 3rd, here at the park, we're hosting our monthly topic is Bitcoin and public policy. So we have 2 panels, and actually, I'll let you kind of share some insight because you were super helpful for me to get the panelists together as well as the content. But we're gonna have a number of policymakers in the audience, a number of just locals in the audience, a number of people traveling in from outside the state of Tennessee, and I think it'll be really helpful and influential. And I think we'll actually, if everyone on the panel opts in, no Q&A be recorded, but we'll record the podcast or record the panels and actually post it on our feed,
Awesome.
assuming everyone opts in for that. But this is the type of conversation I think needs to happen in the open, especially with these folks. So maybe you want to shed some light on what we're going to be talking about on Thursday?
Sure. We're going to be talking about, we're going to have 2 panels. One is going to be on Bitcoin mining and energy, making the argument that not only is Bitcoin, not going to light the planet on fire and end the world, but Bitcoin could actually be one of the most revolutionary technologies that help us, enable a more sustainable future. So that is, panel 1. It's going to be incredible. And panel 2 is going to be discussing Bitcoin, privacy, and central bank digital currencies, understanding different properties of money, what it means when you have, one property in a central bank digital currency. How does that affect how people interact with that money? Is that something that we want to stand for as a country? How has China used their central bank digital currency? And what does it mean to actually have financial privacy? Why is this important? And how can, Bitcoin potentially be an answer as more and more countries, move toward either surveillance capitalism or, surveillance communism?
Totally. And on that first panel you mentioned, we got David Zell, Justin Orkney, who's over at lead analyst over at Duke Energy, so on the energy producing side, and then as well as Harry Sudak coming from Grid, who's a industrial scale miner. Which Harry just always brings it, so I'm really really excited for that. And then on your, you'll be leading the panel on Bitcoin privacy and CBDCs, and we got not only Matthew Pines, who is a fellow at BPI.
National security expert. Yep.
Yeah, which I cannot wait to meet him as well as hear from him. And then Gerald Glickman from the large financial institution. So like that contrast in terms of the conversation should be absolutely dynamic.
And to your point, these are the conversations that need to be had. These are the conversations that are currently not being had in Washington. To go back to an earlier point, just the idea of why are we doing what we're doing? Is this necessary? Does this reach the right people? I think a lot of people in Bitcoin have this idea that, our government is out to get us essentially, or that everyone in government hates Bitcoin and they want to see it fail. One of our early theses for BPI was that most people actually don't have that strong of opinion about Bitcoin yet. You can't have an opinion on something you don't really know much about, or you can, but it's not going to be the most informed opinion. So most people don't know what they don't know. So they don't know enough to love or hate Bitcoin. What that means is the battle lines are still being drawn. The narratives are actively changing, and we have the opportunity to shape those narratives. For the United States, is Bitcoin good? Is Bitcoin bad? Is it somewhere in the middle, right? Right now, there are a large number of people who are teetering on Bitcoin bad. That doesn't mean everybody's on that side. That just means that some of the more vocal people in our government are on that side. Now, ultimately, the reason I bring that up is because you don't get sound policy. You don't get people to come to Bitcoin is good if you don't engage with them, if you don't talk to them, if you don't meet them where they're at, if you don't get them to come to these events, or you don't go to the types of events that they go to, right? So when we talk about Bitcoin and national security, when we talk about Bitcoin and the Biden administration's climate goals, it's not necessarily because that is the thing that is my utmost passion or the thing that I'm most interested in. It's the thing that a lot of people's jobs and livelihoods depend on. They're having those conversations every day, and Bitcoin needs to be inserted into them. Because if Bitcoin isn't in those conversations, we're not having conversations with people who are already discussing these issues. Bitcoin gets left out, or worse, it gets put in the conversation by people who don't know what they're talking about, or people with nefarious purposes that are going to frame it negatively. So ultimately, we got to meet people where they're at. That's the point.
Yeah, agreed. Either that's going to be the title or Bitcoin is Good Part 2 is the title of this pod. What do you call the folks, like companies and people that provide money for candidates, financial backers or
Sure.
yeah, I mean, like, so who's backing Brad Sherman? But now it just seems like, and by the way, that's just me joking around because it just seems like now there's like, oh, this is how I'm going to get engagement farming. I'm going to go take the polar opposite
Exactly.
viewpoint. But there's probably some big banks or some conglomerate that's like supporting that narrative, and they need to push it through.
So you're spot on, and again, to people either giving too little credit or too much credit to our government and government officials and elected officials. The reality is most politicians are just trying to get reelected, right? If that aligns with what's best for their constituents, amazing. But you can look at the data. Politicians, it's not a one-to-one correlation of voting for what their constituents actually believe in. A lot of times they're looking at an issue and they're going, will this issue increase my chances of getting elected? Will it decrease my chances? Now, ultimately, what does that mean? It means, will this position that I take lead me to making more money or lead me to getting less donor money? Will it make people angry or will it make people happy, right? Will it make them vote for me or not? And so ultimately, to your point, there is an incentive right now for people to be anti-Bitcoin, to latch on to the environmental impact piece, because there's a financial incentive for a lot of companies to back a person who's pushing that narrative. So if they're early on that side, there's a lot of money in the game for them. And there are a lot of people who fall into that trap who are going to vote for them because they think that, oh, this person's saving the planet. Without going on too much of a tangent, I think the people who are focusing on Bitcoin mining are ignoring, if you do believe in climate change and you think the world is ending and we're going to, blast past, the 2 degrees Celsius and the world's going to, go on fire. If you believe that and you think stopping Bitcoin mining is what's going to fix that, you've been sold a bag of rocks. Like you've been sold a lie. And so it really frustrates me. Like politicians are taking advantage of people who are actually passionate about legitimate issues and believe that they're fighting for something meaningful, but are being sold the wrong boogeyman, essentially. So long story short, follow the money. That said, the incentives work the other way too. That's the amazing thing, is there's incentive to be pro-Bitcoin. There's a lot of money in this space. A lot of that money is in the United States. A lot of the companies are in the United States. If you're pro-Bitcoin, if you are on what we believe is the right side of history, and you're early, and you're seeing this with someone, for example, like Senator Lummis, who has recognized there's massive opportunity in being early on Bitcoin from a political perspective, you can reap those political gains as well. So what we need to do as an industry is align those incentives, make sure politicians know, hey, there's incentive to be, on one side, but there's also a massive incentive to be pro-Bitcoin.
I love that. And that's actually a great way for this part 2 to kind of like conclude, because you know why? Because we're going to be doing a weekly show together.
I'm pumped.
And then on top of that, I will say, so Thursday, November 3rd, those listening that are local to Nashville or can make it to Nashville, we'd love to have you. Meetup.com/Bitcoin Park. Find the Bitcoin and Public Policy Open House Meetup event page and RSVP. So let me ask you this, and then you provide like your handles where people can find you and so on. But how can people who are listening, went through all this last 45 minutes, how can people help you and Bitcoin Policy Institute?
There's so many ways to help. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say, give me money. I'm going to sit here and say, please give me money. No, I'm kidding. No, there's so many ways to help, and it doesn't all have to do with money, right? A lot of people are jaded by our political system, but the reality is that jadedness leads our political system to not work the way it's supposed to. So essentially, it creates a self-fulfilling cycle where if people think that their vote doesn't matter. They think that their voice doesn't matter. They think that they have no control or opportunity to influence policy and policymakers. Then they don't even try, and then it becomes true, and they don't influence policy and policymakers. At the end of the day, you have more power than you think you do. You can vote with your wallet. You can vote with an actual vote. You can vote with your voice, right? Politicians respond to people being really angry. That's the reality. Very rarely do people, go online and, praise someone for, let's say, like great service, or go to your, I don't know, look at your local 7-Eleven's Google reviews. You're not going to see, wow, my cashier was so nice. You're going to see, they were out of Red Bull, right? Like, I hate terrible customer service, right? Negative things go a lot further than positive things. There's data to back that up as well. So long story short, politicians respond to people being angry, and they respond to their constituents. So to the point of, threats on a federal level, opportunities on a state level, one of the things I encourage Bitcoiners to do is actually reach out to some of your most local representatives, right? City councilmen, state representatives, et cetera. Invite them to your local Bitcoin meetup. I think this is one of the great things about the park.
Bingo.
Is you can get people who work in your state government to show up. The reality is, there are Bitcoiners in our government. There are people who are aligned with freedom and sovereignty and liberty, working in every single state and every single institution that we have in this country. Find those people, bring them to your Bitcoin meetup. They are people like anybody else. They want friends. They want community. That doesn't change just because you work in the government.
Well said, my man. Where can people follow you, and where can people find you?
Sure. So I just released a new album.
Is it the Taylor Swift?
On Spotify.
You did a collab?
It's called Midnights. No.
Tom, let's do a playover of the Midnights and get booted off every single social platform.
Exactly. Just like distort it, and then it's fair use, right? So reverb, et cetera. You can follow me on Twitter, Grant_McCarty, not McCarthy. So MCCARTY. You can find me on LinkedIn, Grant McCarty. I don't really know where else you could find me. Go on BPI, go on our website, btcpolicy.org. Feel free to reach out. Feel free to read our stuff. Feel free to, tell me that you hate what I'm doing. Always love emails.
What's your email?
Grant@btcpolicy.org. Look, BPI is not a black box. I'm a person just like you. I'm a Bitcoiner just like you. You're going to be able to get a hold of me. Love talking to people. And if there's something that you think you can do on your state and local level, reach out. Would love to help in any way I can. Connect you with whoever I can. Or at the very least, say, keep killing it.
I love it, man. And you know what, Grant? Come visit us. This is my weekly shill of Bitcoin Park, but come shill us. Don't come shill us, but come visit us at Bitcoin Park. Grab coffee with Grant and a number of other folks.
We go out to Broadway too. If you really want to get rowdy.
That's for the youngins, yes, that are FR, which I've realized is for real.
Mm-hmm.
And they be bussing down on Broadway.
Yeah, bearish on young people in politics, bullish on young people on Broadway.
That's a great way to close. Thanks, buddy, for the time.
Thanks, Rod.
Hey, everyone. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Grant as much as I did. Having advocates like Grant and his BPI co-founder David Zell educating Washington policymakers about Bitcoin in a language that they understand is an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to advancing and protecting the interests of Bitcoiners, both in the United States and beyond. And by the way, about that new podcast, it's happening, and check your show notes here. If you're enjoying this pod as well and want to automatically stay up to date, please like and subscribe in your favorite podcasting app, and make sure auto download is on. This would also mean the world to me. Lastly, come visit us in Nashville at Bitcoin Park. The Bitcoin community here in Nashville continues to impress and inspire me, and it's growing. We hinted at a number of events, pop-ups, workshops, and meetups, and even launched NashBit Devs. There's a lot more to come in 2023. So if you want to be the first to know, join our meetup page at bitcoinpark.co. That's bitcoinpark.co. And check the show notes for this episode for a link to the Bitcoin Park Discord community server so that you can stay connected with us. See you next time.